Talk to any critic and they'll tell you that some reviews are easier to do than others. Few reviewers relish doing a negative review. I'm certainly no exception, but for me, the hardest kind of review for me to do is reviewing a Knizia game. Ultimately, all right, let me rephrase. It is hard to review Knizia games well. And didn't you, invent algebra or something? Anyway, moving on. So, they're so minimalistic. When you review a Lacerda game, for example, love it or hate it, there's lots of details, lots of stuff to talk about. You can talk about how things fit together, but when you bore things down to an atomistic level, which is essentially what most Knizia designs are, and that's essentially his design process, there's not really much fitting in with anything else because everything is so simple and so clean and so minimalistic. As a result, I find it very, very hard to review them, and frequently, therefore, when you hear people talk about Knizia games, they frequently compare them to other Knizia games, and I do not think that that is because his games are awfully similar, but I think that he is so iconoclastic that nobody else really stands on the same level as him. Now, this may sound like hyperbole, and I may be accused now of being a Knizia fanboy, but let me just give you an object lesson in what it is to be Reiner Knizia. There's a list of games that Reiner Knizia designed. All right, Tigers and Euphrates, Through the Desert, Samurai, Lost Cities, Stevenson's Rocket, and Schottentotten and Rhinelander. Now, not only did he design all those games, all of them excellent, excellent games, but he designed all of those in the space of 2 years. I would take those 2 years of Reiner Knizia's output over the entire catalog of any other designer on Earth. That is how good he is. Now, a few years ago, I might have been inclined to say that's how good he was, because I hadn't enjoyed anything by him for quite some time, but he's in a bit of a resurgence of late, and I think the past few years have been really Knizia returning to form. But anyway, why am I talking about a 20-year-old Knizia? Well, I'm talking about a 20-year-old Knizia largely because I think that it's kind of the antidote, or at least the antithesis, of a lot of what we see in contemporary Euro design. And no, I'm not going to bag on Lacerda anymore. What I'm going to talk about is some of the recent Push Your Luck games, specifically those by Wolfgang Warsch, and of course Roll and Rights. Roll and Rights, to me, I've said this before, I'll say it again, are kind of the apotheosis of all that is wrong in Eurogaming. There's absolutely no player interaction, or sometimes there's only a head nod towards player interaction so that it's not really substantive, and it's got convoluted scoring. People used to joke about how Power Grid, for example, was the game for people who like to do spreadsheets, but in comparison, any roll and write game, these easy, breezy, accessible games are filling out spreadsheets. And I'm not going to deny the joy of some of the scoring mechanisms. Just engaging with incredibly complicated scoring mechanisms can sometimes be fun. I quite enjoy the game Sonora, for example, the flick and write, and figuring out those little puzzles is kind of cute. It's got 4 different scoring puzzles and it's neat to play with, but honestly, it starts to get old after a while, and if it weren't for the flicking, I wouldn't play Sonora at all. And there's nothing inherently problematic about scoring systems that are essentially little puzzles, but again, I want them to be married to something that is actually a consistent game, and ideally, one that offers some kind of player interaction. Some of the recent Push Your Luck games, especially the popular ones by Wolfgang Warsch, are also, I think, very problematic in much the same way. It's essentially every player doing a little puzzle by themselves that's not really satisfying intellectually, but nonetheless has the veneer of an event happening. Take, for example, the Quacks of Quedlinburg, the paradigmatic instance of this. Ooh, I drew a flower. Ooh, I drew another flower. Am I going to draw another flower? Well, I don't care. I'm busy dealing with my own bag. And then I get to make a simple purchasing decision, and then back to the beginning. And then there are games that look like Push Your Luck games, but aren't actually Push Your Luck games at all. They're entirely procedural, and you just pull the cards and do what they tell you to do. I'm thinking here of, again, Taverns of Tiefenthal by Wolfgang Warsch, and I'm also thinking of Mystic Vale, which kind of sort of looks like Press Your Luck, but isn't really. Then there are actual Press Your Luck games like Can't Stop, which are fine. I mean, it's cute and it's fun. Again, not a whole lot of player interaction, but still a lot more in Can't Stop than the other games. One thing that I don't like about Can't Stop, though, is that every pull is atomistically separated from every other pull. Once you've put your markers out, every roll is effectively a standalone experience, and there's no notion of compounding risks to the actual procedure. The risk comes from sacrificing embedded gains, but I would prefer when a Push Your Luck game has some notion of an evolving matrix of what's going on. Can't Stop doesn't really do that. Now, that having been said, it's an incredibly quick game, so it's hard to criticize it too much. This actually leads to mind a pitch I would like to make. I've been designing a game in my spare time, and I think it's ready for the big leagues now, and I think it's really ready for the kind of zeitgeist that we're having in especially the accessible Eurogame market. It's called Roll a 6, Win a Cookie. The rules are pretty simple. I'm not going to belabor the point. And the equipment, I think, is already relatively self-explanatory, but here's the basic gist of the game. So it's a real-time, simultaneous play, any number of players, infinitely expandable, 1 to 100, like any good roll and write. I rolled a 6. I win a cookie. I rolled another 6. I win another cookie. And people love the excellent theming of roll and writes. People love pirates, I guess. You could try Roll a 6 Win a Cookie Pirate Edition, or Lord of the Rings Edition, or Roll a 6 Win a Cookie Legacy Edition. And of course, we're going to have a Kickstarter, right? So you can have Kickstarter exclusives like Hard Mode and Ultra Hard Mode and Ridiculously Hard Mode. Publishers, I await your response. Papa wants a taste. So, Raw. Let's talk about Raw as an auction game first, because actually I think a lot of what makes Raw brilliant has less to do with its auctions and more to do with its attitude towards risk and the way that it introduces subtle dynamics between the players. Raw is an auction game that is defined by its limitations. Normally, an auction game is all about finding the proper value of something and then bidding such that you can profit maximally. Profit usually in the terms of score, but sometimes in terms of money as well. Raw is not like that. In Raw, for one thing, you can't make change. At the start of every round, of which there are 3, you have a specific set of currency. And if you want to buy something for, say, 5, but all that you've got is a 9, you have to decide if you're willing to overpay. So as a result, as a consequence, you don't really value things in terms of this would be worth a 5 but not worth a 9. You instead have to start calculating whether it's worth what you've got, because the opportunity costs aren't just limited to the suns that you have available. That's what the currency is called. It's also limited by the fact that every round you can only acquire a certain number of lots. Usually 3, but sometimes not. And so you have to worry, is this good enough? So you don't start affixing prices. You don't think, is this worth a 25? You start asking, is this good enough, given the opportunity costs that I have to give up, the other lots that I could forgo? Will the grass be greener on the other side of the fence? And as a result, Raw is a lot less calculational and a lot more intuitive. Again, the joke about Euros is that it's all about some sort of calculational exercise like filling out a spreadsheet. Raw defies such characterizations because you have to make these intuitive judgments because, again, it's not about hard currency all the time. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is flatly about hard currency. But that is where playing the other players comes in. Because what your currency valuations are with respect to the other players determines entirely how you are going to play. In Raw, if you're sitting on the highest currency, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can bully the other table around, because what that currency will buy is a function of the choices of the other players. At heart, on your turn in Raw, you either start an auction, known as calling the chicken in my circles, or you add a tile to the available lots. So you've got the highest currency there. You can buy whatever you want, but you'd like to buy more. You'd like to buy as much as possible, all things being equal. But that's only going to happen if the other players let you. If the other players fill out that track with lots of goodies for you to buy, you're going to have to try to make sure that you have them expend their opportunities early on so that you're in a position to buy things that are worthwhile. Or you have to hope that you can be in a position whereby the lots that are available are appealing to you, but not to them. Let me give you a specific object lesson in that particular instance. I'm sure at this point even some of my more patient watchers are now wondering, why do I keep going on about roll and rights when Raw is an auction game? Well, here's the deal. It's all about what comes out of this bag. This is the roll. But rather than my sitting there and hoping that a 12 comes up so I can cross off that box, or a 6 comes up so I can cross off this other box, or whatever, what comes out of the bag, what fills up the track, is of crucial importance for everybody and influences the state of the game. Let me give you an example. This is just a mid-game snapshot. I'm sitting on a 9 and a 3, and let's just say for the sake of argument that the 9 and the 3 happen to trump everybody, and that somebody else has the 4 available. So they'd be able to beat my 3, but not my 9. Let's imagine also that I've only got 2 lots left, and it's about midway through the round, so I have some time, but not a whole lot, so I have to weigh that risk. Looking at this lot, not a whole lot's going on, right? This is a disaster that's going to nuke both of these. Not everything that comes out of the bag is good, and that in turn influences some people more than others, so it's not going to affect the pharaohs, and what I'm left with is a Nile tile and a monument. Not a whole lot of nothing. Now, in certain situations, of course, this could be worth a lot of points to somebody, but let's just stipulate that it's not. So we're looking at a pretty middling lot, except for this. This is a civilization tile. If you end a round without a civilization tile, you lose 5 points.
And Knizia, like most excellent game designers, understands that there's a difference with respect to gaining 5 and losing 5 because of loss aversion, and it affects things very subtly. Now, if you get 3 different kinds of civilization tiles, that's worth a 5-point bonus, so effectively a 10-point swing for nothing. But given that you need 3 different ones, if you have 2 different ones, or 1, or say triplicates of a given civilization tile, there's no difference. At the end of the day, you're all just sitting at nil. Let's further assume that I don't have a civilization tile. Let's further assume that my opponents do. Say one of my opponents already has a civilization tile and another one of my opponents has 2, but this does not help them create a set. So for them, this is really a whole lot of nothing. All they're going to get out of it is these 2 tiles. They don't care about the civilization tile. It doesn't really advance their interests, especially if this is their last lot. If they had another lot left over, maybe they could make a push for 3 different civilizations, but again, let's assume that that's not an issue. But whatever. Maybe I figure I can get it for the 3. Maybe I'm worried that if I call the auction, someone else is going to bid the 4, and then I'm stuck using the 9. So then I figure, okay, if I'm going to use the 9 anyway, let's try to make this lot better. Let's see what happens when I draw from the bag. So we pull from the bag, and oh crap. It's a Civil War tile. Civil War tiles nuke 2 civilization tiles when you win them. Suddenly now, this lot is worthless to me. Again, just worth these 2. But that's not the only salient result. Remember what I said before. Imagine that one of our opponents already sitting on 1 civilization tile. Well, if they win this lot, then this Civil War will nuke the one that they gain and the one they were already sitting on. So in effect, this lot is worth negative points to them. I can write them out. I know they're not going to make a play for this lot. On the other hand, the person who had 2 civilization tiles already, well, they were sitting on 0 points for civs, and they're still going to be worth 0 points for civs because they're going to end up effectively where they were before. So it's crippling to one player, no difference to 2 players, but in effect it is kind of a difference to one of the players by virtue of the fact that they should have tried to make a play for this when it came up, but they took a risk and it turned out badly. I mean, alternately, or you could roll a 6 and cross off a box.
The other great thing about Raw is that unlike other auction games or trick-taking games or ladder games or what have you, if you have the lowest value currencies available, if all that you've got is garbage, either accidentally or deliberately, you're actually in a unique position of power because you can now start bullying people by virtue of your weak economic situation until they call your bluff. Because you can just start auctions all the time. Any lot is worth 2 to you, for example, or 1. You can hardly be accused of overspending when it's the most garbage son on the table. But on the other hand, if you force people to call your bluff, then you'll start buying stuff that maybe you don't want, and then you'll lose your power. And so there's very different kinds of power, and very different abilities to manipulate other people's buying decisions. And as a result, it's intuitive and psychological and social, as opposed to all these other games, which are nominally about pushing your luck, about trying to get the most value out of things, which ultimately feel like calculational exercises or head-down experiences where you're not really engaging with the rest of the players. And that is why Raw is so delicious. Now, to be sure, there's also a spectacle element, right? People talk about the spectacle of Taverns of Tiefenthal watching people go bust and enjoying either the schadenfreude or vicariously through their success. But Raw has that same moment. Because, as I said, you can only win a certain number of lots per era, per round. Once you're out, you're out. It doesn't feel like player elimination because now you get to potentially watch someone doing what I call playing chicken with the chicken. If you're the last one left, the only one left with currency, you can fill up the track as much as you like. But, again, you have to be worried about those disaster tiles, and you have to worry about the game clock, because if the game clock expires, the round ends, and you get nothing. And you're not able to use that last purchase. And that can be incredibly frustrating and also incredibly fun and funny for everyone else. So there you are, thinking about whether to pull a tile from the bag, and everyone else is egging you on, saying, come on, don't be a sucker, you can take one more, Raw is going to be nice to you. Meanwhile, as you reach into the bag, literally as you're reaching into the bag, everyone starts pounding the table chanting, Raw, Raw, Raw. It's wonderful. It's one of those great moments in gaming. You don't need an incredibly bloated plastic experience to have those kinds of wonderful moments or elements of storytelling or drama. Raw provides it all. Allow me to turn to 2 of the common criticisms of Raw. One of them is kind of legitimate, but somewhat misguided. It is the notion that Raw is especially punishing to new players. Now, to a certain extent, that's true. It's very accessible in terms of rules, but new players are not apt to do well. And that is largely because Raw is shockingly deterministic, which addresses the second criticism, that it is arbitrary and random. Despite the fact that there's a high degree of apparent variance in any given degree of a game of Raw, what comes out of the bag and when, you're going to find that experienced players win an overwhelming preponderance of the time. I don't mean like 60% of the time, I mean like 90% of the time. Raw is one of the most deterministic Euro games I know, especially one for any variance whatsoever. You have to go to pretty much pure no-luck Euros to find more reliable winning percentages for people that really, really know the game well. To a certain extent, auction games are generally unforgiving for new players. They don't really know what things are worth, but on top of that, Raw has all these elements of tempo, of playing the other players, of knowing when a 2 is stronger than a 10, and all those other great nuances that I talked about before. And as a result, lots of new players find Raw very intimidating. Fortunately, though, they largely only get the punchline at the end of the game when they see that their score is 30 and the expert's score is 60. During the game, they're not going to feel punished. In fact, they might even feel like they're running the table because they've got their 10s and their 12s and they're outbidding all the experts with the 5s and 7s, but the experts will have the last laugh. Now, whether that means that your group is going to find it accessible or not is very much up to you. Then there's the theme. Yeah, I'm familiar with all the cliches about how Euro games are themeless, but I have to concede that in the case of Raw, it's actually really appropriate. Yeah, you know, there's the window dressing, the trappings of Egyptian mythology, and I have heard some people solemnly intone about how it makes perfect sense how things score because monuments should only score at the end of the game because you only value them centuries later. Well, we know that's wrong because Knizia's interesting, albeit less good variant of Raw called Priests of Raw had buildings that scored at the end of each of the 3 rounds, so clearly that wasn't on his mind. So it's a little bit pasted on, and I find it unfortunate, sometimes even annoying, when games mine rich mythological backstories for just so much as a thinly veneered spackle of some kind of graphic design. On that topic, actually.
This handsome devil is Sobek. He's one of the gods featured in the game Raw. And there's some disagreement about where his name comes from. Oh, he's got a lot of great epithets. He of the pointed teeth, he who loves robbery, he who eats while mating. No judgment. As time goes on, political winds change, and he becomes less associated with the purely violent aspects of the Nile, him being a crocodile and all, and eventually he becomes associated with the warding off of evil of the Nile. And as political developments ensue, he becomes associated with the cult of Horus. There becomes the cult of Sobek Horus, and eventually even Sobek Ra, in the way that, you know, Egyptian gods tended to Voltron together when they needed to. And so, ultimately he became associated with the myth whereby Osiris was torn to pieces by Set, and the pieces of his body were brought together by Isis, and Anubis performed the first embalming, and he became the mummy god. Effectively, Osiris is a dead god, literally dead. And ultimately, Sobek was the one who helped Isis bring the pieces together. He found the scattered bits of body parts. And so there's some disagreement as to where the name Sobek comes from. Either he who impregnates, or possibly he who brings together, i.e. the body parts of Osiris. And in the board game, he's worth 2 points.
Finally, a brief word about the many editions. Raw has been in and out of print over the course of about 20 years, and it's been published by many different publishers, many different editions. And for my money, if you can find it, the best edition is the 2006 Uberplay version, mostly because it hits the sweet spot in terms of both form and function. It's got these large tiles that show off the Franz Vohwinkel art, which is the original art from the Alia version.
Put the guitar